So I'll be chairing today's session. My name's Chris Morris. I'm the Deputy Head of Financial Planning at the CISI. If you do have any questions, do put them in the Q&A box at the bottom. If we have time, then we will be taking those a little bit later on. But really, introducing you to today's speakers, really sort of important area and topic. And I'm delighted to introduce you to two speakers. We have firstly Martin Lyons, who's a Business Development Director at Just. And Martin's role within Just is that he heads up their retirement and later life specialist team, supporting advisor training events and conferences across the UK. Martin joined the partnership in 2009 ahead of the creation of Just, having worked alongside local and national advisor firms on pensions and retirement-related issues. He's a regular speaker at financial services events with subjects ranging from the technical issues to consumer vulnerability and behavioural biases. So joining Martin in the session is Graham Duffy, who is a care specialist at Just. And Graham has over 41 years of experience within financial services, working in the Lloyd's reinsurance market for 23 of those years, and then becoming an instrumental part of the new long-term care division at Just. So really interesting topic. Delighted to introduce you to the virtual stage, Martin and Graham. I think you've got some slides to share as well, Martin. So good afternoon.
We'll give that a go.
Great stuff. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you. There we are. Thank you very much, and welcome to this session on coercion and mental capacity. Really important subject. So I know it's something that a few people have asked us to talk about. So we're delighted that the CISI have asked us to cover this subject today. So thanks really very much for that. It obviously forms part of our vulnerability program that we've been running for some time. And many of you may have been at the Power Planner conference and heard Carl Steadman talk about this area around consumer vulnerability. So this is a bit more of a deep dive into one or two specific areas. So just again, it's good to be with you today. I know it's difficult times at the moment, so good that we can all gather together to talk about some of these issues. So what I want to do really over the next, Graham and I, the next 45 minutes or so, is just look at why this area is so important, really recognising the signs of financial abuse and coercion, because it is a form of coercion, as we'll see. So what is it? What actions can you take as planners, as firms, in terms of spotting the signs of this sort of things and the steps that you might want to take to help clients through some of these issues? And how do we help people who are perhaps more susceptible due to things like lower mental capacity, which Graham will be joining me to talk about as well. So it's a really important area, and I think, if we look back to the purpose of financial planning, really, I suppose, is to help people to get control of their finances and to get them in a better place and to meet their dreams and aspirations around that. So really, let's take a proactive and a positive view on this in terms of how we might help folk along this. Now, the consumer vulnerability agenda has been rolling on for some time. We've had more papers out this year, but again, you may have seen some of these before, since going back sometimes to 2005, back to OP8 and so on. Loads and loads of information around consumer vulnerability, and we've done workshops with you up and down the country, obviously until recently. So obviously we're gaining insights from yourself on all of these things as we go along as well. Now, last year there was a guidance consultation that was published in July, and so again, we've been through those sort of documents before in other sessions, but we've been happy to chat about that more at the round table. But more recently, we've had this July 2020 document, GC 2003, really encapsulating what's going on with the vulnerability agenda, really confirming what firms ought to be doing, looking at some of the supervisory aspects as well around consumer vulnerability. But they have specifically mentioned in here financial abuse as an area. And so it's really topical at the moment, as we look into the evolving of this vulnerability agenda from the FCA, starting to highlight some of the things that we're talking about today. I think it is, however, worth just going back a step and just reminding ourselves of the four key areas, the four key triggers, if you like, of consumer vulnerability that were identified. Because I think they're really pertinent, not least of all because we're in a sort of social distance, COVID type environment, and these areas are being really tested at the moment. But it does mean that there's a lot of people out there who may be more susceptible, to things like financial abuse and coercion, unfortunately. And if you remember, the definition of vulnerability is to look after those people who may be more susceptible to detriment because of their current circumstances. So if we look at health, for example, obviously health is part of the COVID conversation. It's causing a lot of anxiety with people. We keep switching on the news and hearing about this balance between, social distancing and mental health and so forth. And certainly those issues around stress, anxiety, depression, the worry that goes alongside the current climate obviously is a key part of the health conversation as well. We need to be mindful of that. And again, I'll touch on how relevant that is to what today's issue is as well. Life events, and lots of people are going through lots of different experiences, certainly changes in terms of perhaps feeling isolated for the first time, at least to this current degree, or they're going through a situation where they're caring for somebody who may be living with some of these coronavirus type issues, or maybe shielding and things like that, and maybe helping somebody who's in one of those circumstances. And then resilience was a key factor that the FCA mentioned around not just the resilience in terms of coping with some of these issues, but the financial resilience as well, which clearly is a key part that financial planners can help with. And all of these things, are being really tried and tested at the moment. Capability we'll come on to later when we talk about capacity and things like that as well. But all of this creates an environment where we can see that, there is worries about things like domestic abuse, for example, taking place. And aligned to that often, certainly some reports would say in the majority of cases, there is some sort of financial abuse that goes alongside that. So I've counseled a few planners around this as well, sort of preparing for this session. And one of them was saying, actually, this is almost a fifth area. Well, it is a fifth area, because whilst these might create an environment where you may find more financial abuse, and we can talk about scams and things like that, this is something that deserves attention in its own right, really. So in the latest document then from the FCA, they do start to allude to this whole area and the importance of it. So those characteristics that we've just seen, those 4 triggers, and we can widen the scope of that. And as we've seen, the FCA going away from this potentially an actual vulnerability to more of a breadth of vulnerabilities that might apply. But people with those characteristics may be more likely to fall victim to scams, so financial crime effectively, and may be more targeted through unsolicited approaches, and maybe more trusting or likely to be persuaded to disclose financial details, as people do things that are perhaps not as rational as they might have already have done previously. Their decision making might be impaired because of some of those issues. Clearly, it's easier for people to fall foul of some of the scams and abuses that might be perpetrated. So I wonder, when you're sitting down with a client, whether it be somebody by themselves or perhaps with a couple, it's just something that just doesn't look right, something that just doesn't quite make sense. For some reason, they're reticent in terms of providing all their financial information. We're going to have a look at some of the signs that you might find around some of these issues. From a scams perspective, of course, the FCA have been out there, highlighting Scam Smart, making sure that people are aware of what can be perpetrated. And one of the key reasons in this current climate of keeping in touch with people is to make sure they're aware of the things that are going on. And we see this all the time, don't we? And again, as we've been up and down the country, there's always examples of scams, whether that be somebody who's insistent on giving money away to somebody they've just met, or whether it be emails coming from somebody, or seem to be coming from somebody but it's actually from somebody else. There's a raft of these things, TV licensing, even COVID scams going on at the moment, for testing and things like that. So first step in all of this, fundamental step, is clearly keeping in touch with clients and making sure they're aware of the financial crimes and scams that are going on, because clearly you could save people a fortune. However, if we take that one step further, what we've got to recognize is that most of the time when financial crime is taking place, or certainly a lot of the time, it's actually perpetrated by somebody that the client actually knows. So whilst we've sort of tagged on the globally bit at the end of this, the title for today's session, so we've looked at what's happening in the States and looked at a few different examples, and something like 70% of elder abuse, for example, is perpetrated by somebody who's known to the victim or from the person that's undergoing that abuse. And so it is here as well, that financial abuse is, happens to people that, tend to be somebody that's known to them. So you've got the scams on one side, but actually there's other things to think about. And maybe these are things that for some people might not seem so obvious. It's a bit like the boiling frog syndrome, isn't it? I'm sure you've heard about that. You put a frog into boiling water and it'll jump straight out. Whereas if you put it in cold water and turn the heat up gently, it will stay there and, dare I say it, croak sometime in the future. But nevertheless, some of these things might appear normal to clients in terms of the way they've got used to dealing with their finances. Whether it be in a intimate partner, married relationship, or something else, that's just the way we've always done things. But you can see where the dangers come. I mean, looking at this stat here again from the FCA's recent paper, 1 in 5 adults, equating to over 10 million adults in the last 12 months, have given their credit debit card to somebody else, or their PIN number or passwords, etc. And you can see that in this sort of information technology age, how that can really exacerbate the problem, and people lose control perhaps of their finances quite easily. So here are the numbers then. And when we were researching this, I was quite surprised by the numbers, and perhaps you will be too, but it just goes to show how widespread this issue is. So 1 in 5 is a number of women in the UK who have experienced some form of financial abuse from a current or former partner. And actually, when you look at the examples, whether it be from Money Advice Service, from Citizens Advice, from SEA and from others, there tends to be this sort of emphasis on the women in the partnership that tend to go through this experience. That's just the facts that are coming through. However, you also, depending on which survey you read, you also find that it does happen to guys as well. So and oftentimes, we don't know about this, probably for the reason number 3, which is that a third or more of victims, or survivors as they hopefully will become, didn't tell anyone at the time. And that could be for a number of reasons. And this is why it's so difficult sometimes to pinpoint whether financial abuse is taking place, because often people are maybe embarrassed that they've actually fallen for one of these sorts of things, because it's something that's involved in often a family or environment or somebody that's known to the client. There's an element of not wanting to get somebody into any form of problems or anything like that, and things of this nature. It just could be an embarrassment, or just not realizing that it is financial abuse that's taking place until sometime after the event, when you look back and think, well, hang on, that wasn't quite right. And so a lot of the concentration on this is around financial abuse in intimate relationships. And it's the reason that we've tied this in with coercion is that it is a form of coercion. By somebody taking control of another person's finances, clearly this is a form of abuse, and there is a it's an illegal, it's a criminal sort of situation. And and I think when you're sitting down with clients in terms of trying to work out the best route and taking an objective view, and again, it's just a case of calling something out. It doesn't look quite right. Have you ever been in a situation where one person is perhaps dominating the conversation when you're speaking to a couple? Why is that? It's important to get both people's views on the advice that's taking place, and making sure that there's transparency around the whys and wherefores. I think sometimes when control is exerted from one person to another, from a financial planning aspect, you've not only got that control issue, but actually can be detrimental for them from a financial perspective anyway. You've got somebody who's perhaps on a lower income, and maybe they're not using their tax allowances, that it might be preferential to do so because somebody else is actually more concerned with controlling the finance. Or they may not be eligible for benefits because, I don't know, let's take child benefit for an example. There's no point in some cases, sort of knocking out on the head where because you're not eligible for it as a couple, but it might be that you're missing out on credits for state pension, for example, if you're not claiming it, or if you're claiming it goes into the wrong name. So there are lots of implications around somebody trying to exert control, which can affect somebody's finances. So it is a case of taking charge and almost being the sort of, dare I say it, somebody mentioned to me, being the grown up in that consultation to take that objective view if something doesn't look quite right. So financial abuse from a partner can, it's a whole list of things. This is on the UK finance document. It's also reiterated on the Money Advice Service website as well. So anything that just doesn't look quite right, and this is, obviously is aimed at consumers, but stopping somebody from going to work or college, controlling their education, that sort of thing. Now, I think there's also a line here, isn't there, where you say, right, okay, from a financial planning perspective, this is the way we think we should set out your budget. This is what you should, let's have a look at what you spend on groceries and shopping and food and clothing, etc., bills, mortgage. But when you get to a stage where it's kind of quite dictatorial from one person to the other, that says, you need to give me a receipt for everything that you spend and things of this nature, or there's a lack of transparency where both parties aren't aware of all the accounts that they've got and things like that, then perhaps again that should be something that starts to ring alarm bells. And I know one advisor who sort of gives an A5 card to people, say, right, okay, here's our summary of consumer vulnerability, and included within that are some of the signs around this as well, to identify whether any of these things are sort of taking place. And it's starting to get clarified now, because, as I mentioned, this does come under domestic abuse, but the Domestic Abuse Bill 2020 starts to clarify things as well around all of this. So financial abuse in terms of limiting people or controlling their finances, coercing people in terms of how they might use their finances was one thing. They're also extending this to say, actually, there's a knock-on effect to other other aspects of life, basic resources such as food, clothing, and transportation. So it recognizes that there's this knock-on aspect. It's not just necessarily controlling the funds, but it's controlling other aspects and access to different things. They mentioned there again being forced to take out loans or entering into other financial contracts. And this really can have a knock-on effect to people who maybe gone through a divorce or a partnership that's split up. And, you often get one member of that couple might be left with, left holding the baby, so to speak, in more ways than one, in the sense of, credit being taken out and things like that. We've heard of one person who, partner left them, £30,000 or thereabouts worth of credit card debt stacked up, and a real pickle in terms of their credit rating thereafter and so forth. So again, it's just recognizing that these can have massive implications. And then you get this situation where it might be something doesn't look right, where there's a family member, friend, partner, or care, and again there's a whole list of things there. I won't go through each of them, but again, in sort of talking to some financial planners around this, we heard the story of somebody who was a pensioner, and they in a vulnerable situation, pretty much socially isolated, apart from one friendly neighbour who had arranged to go and pick up their pension for them, was coming back, and it looked a bit short. And this is happening time and time again, and the reason that it wasn't reported was because that was their only social contact. And so so some very sad stories around this, in terms of the sort of the whys and wherefores in terms of why people put up with these things. But clearly there's a list of quite serious things there. Somebody's asked you to change your will. We also heard of a story of somebody whose friend is a surgeon who gets documents waved in front of people as they've just come out of surgery and things like that, and thinking, well, what's going on here? So again, from an advisor perspective, this whole area of coercion and financial abuse is a serious one. We have had examples, as we've spoken to CISI again up and down the country, great examples of people who perhaps look to get the help of a third party, substitute decision maker, family members who are involved in the transaction, and then they make sure that they actually call the client afterwards just by themselves, to make sure that they weren't under duress, and they were happy with how the conversation went and so on. And sometimes the person says, no, I wasn't happy with it. I've even heard of situations where a third party, maybe a solicitor's been removed from the room to talk to a client by themselves and things like that, just to make absolutely sure that the client that you're dealing with is happy with what's going on. There are lots of other stories around that, unfortunately, but there's just a few examples. One of the things that we try and do at Just is just to provide some details in terms of how you might spot the signs of different things, of vulnerability generally and mental capacity and things like that. And this is one on financial abuse. And it's just where something just doesn't look or sound right. So again, whether it's you're talking to somebody face to face, again, quite difficult at the moment, or having to use that skill set and just listening through what they're telling you on the telephone or via Zoom or whatever it might be. But they don't really seem to have a handle on what their own finances are. They don't really know how things are being paid for in the household, because maybe there's accounts they're not aware of, or where's that money coming from, or they don't appear to have control over their own money or access to it. I'm not going to go through all of these, but clearly unexplained or unusual withdrawals that don't fit in with the advice that you've given or don't seem logical. Big chunks of money going out of an account with no real explanation of what it's been used for. It doesn't fit in with a budget that you've set out and things like that. Unusual changes in financial documents. At the extreme, you can get to the stage of forged signatures and things like this. So, and as mentioned, the figures are here, for women is 1 in 5, men is 1 in 7, but you can see these are quite big numbers in terms of these different situations. We did have a situation recently we heard about. Again, I was just talking to a couple of people about this, where they had a client who come into a large sum of money. So the mother had come into a large sum of money. I think she's sort of mid-90s, and the advisor went in, the planner went in to have an initial meeting with her, but it was very difficult to have the meeting without 2 sons present, and they actually having to hold an enduring power of attorney. But as the conversation ensued, which happened to be at the other end of the room, out of earshot from the mother, it transpired that actually the mother hadn't lost capacity at all. And yet, you get things like the 2 sons saying, well, this is what we're going to do with the money. And, all these sorts of things that don't ring true. And there was a whole set of actions that the advisor had to take, not least of all talking them through their responsibilities under their sort of attorney duties and things of that nature. And obviously, actions were taken to sort of turn that situation around. And we'll talk to Graham a little bit later on, attorneys and the protections that can be given in those situations, because tens of thousands of older people are at risk of financial abuse. And whether that be through some of the issues that we've already talked about, the loneliness, the isolation, the sort of wanting to trust other people, or it could be because there's reduced cognitive function. According to the stats, again, UK Finance, women are twice as likely as men to be victims of financial abuse in later life, maybe life expectancy, or just, lots of people obviously living by themselves. And you've got the stats in terms of the sorts of age groups. And so in some ways, this has always been an issue, hasn't it? It's just taken a different form now, in many ways. I can remember years back, hearing, sort of stories, and you watch these sort of Horizon programs and all the rest of it around different ways in which elderly people are being taken advantage of, whether it's, rogue traders, etc. But actually, this is now becoming, this sort of abuse is now starting to permeate as people get a little bit more wise to sort of the things that can be done. So obviously, there's a big bit of protection that we need to do here. So again, in GC 2003, again, it specifically looks at this coercion issue, and it says if a firm seriously doubts the ability of a consumer to understand a product or service, or suspects a consumer doesn't have capacity to make decisions, or acting as a result of fraud or coercion, then obviously it's a case of assessing whether that might be appropriate to So I'm going to bring Graham in now just to talk about some of the protections that are available, and we're going to look specifically at the mental capacity issue and how that might, how you might help people in those particularly. Welcome, Graham.
Thank you, Martin, and good afternoon, everybody. Yes, I'm sure you'll be pleased to know I'm not going to go through a huge amount of detail on the Mental Capacity Act, which is a huge, huge document. The guidance alone sort of stands so high off the desk. But the Mental Capacity Act 2005, which came into effect, I'd say, in October 2007, was many, many years in the making. There was a huge amount of effort put into putting that act together. A lot of input from charities, mental health charities, and all those kinds of entities, and I think even financial services may have had a bit of input on it, because of obviously people making financial decisions and have they got capacity to do so, etc. And clearly, when we look at the Mental Capacity Act, it relates to all aspects of mental capacity. It's not just around people having powers of attorney, etc. But under the MCA 2005 is when we saw the introduction of the lasting power of attorney, which effectively replaced the old enduring power of attorney, which was the document you had under the EPA Act 1985. The EPAs are still valid for financial decisions, but you can't write any new enduring powers of attorney. So you have to, if you're doing a power of attorney now, you have to do a lasting power of attorney, of which there are two types. So we'll look at the 5 underlying principles of the Act. Let's just have a quick look through those principles, because that's what kind of underpins the whole Act, really, in terms of, although there's a huge amount of documentation involved in this, these are the main points to it, the underlying principles of it. And that the first point, as you'll see there, is a presumption of capacity. You can't just assume that somebody hasn't got capacity because of how they look, how they act, how they speak, or anything like that. So there's got to be that starting point of presumption of capacity. And again, clearly, there's a bit of a balance with a lot of this stuff in terms of if somebody's got a very serious form of dementia, serious form of Alzheimer's or something like that, then clearly they probably haven't got capacity. However, what they say with capacity is actually decision specific. So you could have people, even people with dementia, can't just be labelled as completely, lacking capacity, because they could have good days and bad days. And we all sort of have that scenario where we can't be bothered to make a decision, and we quite often defer it. So it's the same sort of principle, really. And some people might be, they might be able to make some basic financial decisions, but when it comes to the more complicated stuff, they'd rather pass that on to someone else. So you have to assume capacity to start with, unless it's established beyond doubt that they haven't got the capacity to make any decisions at all, which can prove quite difficult. So again, we're looking sort of very high level at this stuff at the moment. There are lots of experts that deal with all of this stuff day in, day out. So decision specific and presumption of capacity to start with. And moving on from that, you'll see that then individuals should be supported to make their own decisions wherever possible, or certainly supported to make those decisions, and involved in the decision-making process. So even if somebody has got power of attorney, again, clearly, if it's a mild form of dementia and they can make some decisions, inform them of what's going on, especially when it comes to investments and things like that. Again, when it gets to those stages where somebody has clearly lost capacity, then that perhaps is not going to be possible. So it's a different scenario. So helping those people to make those decisions and certainly be involved in them is one of the other underlying, one of the main principles. The other one that's interesting is the individual decisions should be respected. So and I suppose the thinking there is that just because somebody might want to make a decision that we might consider, or other people might consider to be unwise, doesn't mean to say they can't make that decision. Now, clearly, this is something that also needs a bit of balance to it as well, because if somebody's going to make something that's completely haywire and completely wrong and could endanger them in some way, then they shouldn't be making that decision, and perhaps be trying to be steered away from that. But the argument is that we all make unwise decisions throughout our lives. And sometimes with the benefit of hindsight, we all say, well, I shouldn't have done that, or whatever. So it's the same sort of principle again with regard to people that would appear to lack capacity. And they actually do give quite a good example in the guidance to the Mental Capacity Act. And they talk about a 40-year-old man with a history of mental health issues. And he sees his community psychiatric nurse regularly. But what he wants to do is he wants to spend a couple of £1,000 of his savings on a camper van to go around Scotland for 6 months. So because of his mental health issues, obviously the initial reaction is, oh, is that really wise? So his CPN is concerned that it will be difficult to give Mr. Garvey continuous support and treatment while travelling, and his mental health might deteriorate as a result. Now, this is obviously non-financial, but it gives you a feel for the sort of thing that needs to be considered. Then, having talked it through with his CPN, it's clear that Mr. Garvey is fully aware of the concerns and has capacity to make this particular decision. He has decided he would like to have the break and thinks it will actually be good for him. So there's that side to it as well. So just because, in the CPN's opinion, continuity of care might be a wiser option, it should not be assumed that Mr. Garvey lacks the capacity to make that decision for himself. So might be considered unwise, but he's in the position, it's decided he's got capacity to make that decision. So why should he not do that? So that's quite important. The next one is everything should be done in the best interest of the donor or the person that you're acting for. For instance, if it's the medical professional, social care, they've all got to act in the best interest of that individual. And that is where, when you start acting as a power of attorney, it actually gets quite important, especially when it comes to investments and things like that. And we'll touch on a bit more detail on that in a second. But the kind of thing, when it comes to the care profession, it can get a bit more difficult, because what is in their best interest, what's right for them, what's wrong for them, and all those sorts of things. But basically, the principle of it should be, I suppose, a bit of common sense, certainly when it comes to financial decisions, of what is in their best interest, and certainly when it comes to things like care funding and things like that. So not investing anything that might be deemed to be high risk, etc., because older people haven't got the time to make up losses in downturns in investments, etc., if that is what's going to happen. The final one is least restrictive intervention, and it's this, again, I apply a lot of this to the care or the health profession, because it's the kind of situation, a good scenario for that, example of that might be, again, non-financial. But if you've got a gentleman, and it's an example I've heard on from, I think it was Tish Hannifan gave this example. If you had a gentleman that's got a really bad problem with his teeth and he ends up with an abscess, which is he's in a care home, he needs to go to hospital because he's now in such a bad way, but he's got a paranoia about dentists and he just does not want to go to the dentist. So how do they actually get him to get to the hospital? Do they use a chemical cost? Do they physically restrain him? It's really difficult for them, because they've got to do that with the least possible restrictive intervention, and they've got to record how they've done all that. So it makes it quite difficult for them to record. So you see the sort of principles that are underlying the Mental Capacity Act. So that's the kind of, as I say, not going into huge detail on that, but it's the kind of thing that has to be considered when looking at capacity of any individual. So moving on to the next slide, which I think might take a second to come up, if it's coming up at all. Oh, here we go. So good old Bruce, he's arrived on the conveyor belt with his lovely boy. So Bruce is, I'll touch on some of the documentation that we've got that will help you get more broad level understanding of some of this stuff. But this is really in helping to support people that may lack mental capacity, etc. And as I say, remember that it's kind of decision specific. It can be a bit of a moving target. Martin's touched on some of the signs of financial abuse, but there are also some signs for triggers and signs of lack of mental capacity. So, is somebody, trying to influence, all that sort of thing. So it's the same kind of principles with spotting those signs. And then how do you then deal with that and support those people who may lack capacity? So the first one is considering the behaviors. So this is where the Brucey comes from. What are they saying and doing and all those sorts of things? Are they being illogical about all sorts of things? Does it not make any sense? Some of those triggers, again, people trying to influence what they're doing and all that sort of stuff. And are they generally struggling with their decision making? So some of them might seem obvious. I think one of the issues with all of this sort of stuff with regard to vulnerability and capacity is, if you've had a client that you've had for many years and that you know quite well, it's probably well, not easy, but it's easier to spot those signs with something. If their attitude changes, if perhaps they were very reasonable, very sharp, very quick thinking, and now suddenly they're being quite aggressive and don't seem to understand things, that's a bit of a giveaway that something might be going wrong. And it might also highlight perhaps if there's any sort of undue influence, etc., on what's going on. So then it's remembering is the R in the Bruce. So just perhaps again getting that balance right between not being too condescending, but looking at is it worth saying, do you want me to repeat that? Offer to repeat things just to make sure that it's been understood. does it need to be put in writing, or are you happy with just this verbal discussion? So offer to put it in writing if that's what's required. I think most people prefer to have things in writing these days anyway. And is any kind of help needed to get a better grasp? And that's quite a common theme, to again being difficult in terms of the condescending nature that this can appear to be, but just generally, is it worth having somebody closer, a loved one nearby, that can perhaps come in and help sort of people to understand what's being put to them, etc. So on that very thing of understanding is the you. So a matter of then checking that understanding. So have they grasped the concept that's been put to them? With perhaps relatively straightforward, simple financial matters, that's probably perfectly okay. But if you get to more complicated investments, that's when it starts to get a bit more difficult. So again, just repeating things to make sure that it has been absorbed and absolved, and acknowledged and understood. And then again, having someone to help if that's what's required. So then communicating. So what kind of methods are used to communicate? Is it hard copy letters? Is it emails? All those sorts of things. Time of day is another quite an important one. Again, perhaps in later life, people do need a bit of a snooze in the afternoon sometimes. Not everyone, but some of them might do. Medication can also have an effect. Perhaps it makes you drowsy. Quite often you see just basic, stuff that you can buy over the counter in chemists. It says, don't take this if you're using heavy machinery and stuff like that. So it can cause drowsiness, can't it? All that sort of stuff. So if you're on stronger medication, that can actually, affect your capacity to absorb information, etc. And then asking them to take time to sit and think about things and make sure they've grasped everything. So then it's a matter of then evaluating the final part of the Bruce. So weighing up those options that have been put and going through any options again. And do again the option of consulting with a third party if that's what's required, getting the balance right again with regard to not being too condescending, etc. So as I say, we've got a lot of great information documents on our website and on our stand today. So if you want any of this information, we go through all of the different aspects of vulnerability, some of which Martin's touched on, and which you'll find really useful if you've read through some of that FCA documentation. So we've got documentation on the Bruce that I've just touched on. There is documentation on generally on some of the triggers and spotting the signs around lack of mental capacity. The idea, so how to elicit information around medical conditions, etc. Because again, a lot of people don't want to talk about any medical issues they might have and don't want to admit there are problems, etc. So TEXIS is the recording of sensitive info. So there's a lot of desktop, desktop information on that. All high level because it can get quite, you can be quite in depth on some of this stuff. And then Blake is that final one on discussion about life, and for those people that perhaps get a bit even, sort of suicidal. So moving on to the advisory process when it comes to long-term care, I would say that virtually every case that's dealt with, certainly that comes into us for applications for our care plan, our immediate care plan, the advisors are dealing with substituted decision makers, and in most powers of attorney. So, and in most cases those powers of attorney are sons and daughters that are acting on behalf of mum or dad who need care. Sometimes, yes, it can be a solicitor or it could be a court-appointed deputy. So, sometimes but I'd say the vast majority, at least probably 95%, I reckon, are family members. So as such, you are going to be having discussions with the family. The family are going to be involved. And if for you to discuss anything with the family about, mum or dad's care, they need to have the right documentation in place to do that, i.e. power of attorney. It could be for financial decisions. It could be the old EPA. As long as it was signed and witnessed prior to October 2007, then it's still a valid document. If there isn't, then it's got to be a lasting power of attorney. If there is no power of attorney documentation in place at all, then it's got to go through the court of protection. So all those decisions have to go through the court to make sure that what they're doing is the right thing. And that's when they appoint a court-appointed deputy. With regard to this scenario, and I would caveat this by saying you would hope that for most people, if they're acting on behalf of their mum or dad, would be acting in their best interest, wouldn't they? That's what you would assume. But there is the potential for that conflict of interest. So i.e., are the sons and daughters acting in their own interests, i.e. they see this as their inheritance, therefore their money, or are they saying, I just want to make sure that my mum or dad gets the best quality of care for the rest of their lives, keep them as comfortable as possible for those last few years. Again, stressing that I would hope that in the vast majority of cases, it is, you know, the latter, and they want to make sure that mum or dad get the best quality care. But I'm sure you've come across cases where perhaps, you know, that doesn't happen. So, and I think Martin talked about, you know, the COVID situation. I just got a horrible feeling that you could get people that, you know, a year ago would never have even thought about perhaps doing something that isn't in the best interest. But if their financial position gets so dire as a result of redundancy or some other issues, or even furloughing could have caused lots of problems, does that mean that they would be tempted to actually say, well, actually, it doesn't matter if I dip in because I'm going to inherit that money? So there could be conflicts there. It could increase that likelihood of conflicts of interest, shall we say. So moving on to a specific case on that highlights the duties of attorneys and how the courts perceive how attorneys should act. There was which was a niece who had power of attorney for her aunt, and the niece owned her own reptile farm, and she decided a great place, having got power of attorney for her aunt, auntie was the donor, she decided a great place for auntie's money was in the reptile farm, which, believe it or not, went bust. So auntie's money was lost. So Judge Lush at the time, he was the master of the rolls, I think he was the most senior judge, and he said, this is crazy. You know, just because you become a power of attorney doesn't mean to say you can go off and do what you want with that donor's money. And you, as you hopefully you can see there, what he states is that an act done or decision made for or on behalf of personally lapsed capacity must be done or made in their best interest. An attorney's position imposes duties on them. Like trustees, they must exercise such care and skill as reasonable when investing the donor's assets. This duty is greater when they hold themselves out as having specialist knowledge. Now, most people won't have specialist knowledge, will they? But what he talks about is if you take advice, professional advice, so whether it's legal or financial, those advisors must have regard to the code of practice. So although it's not the duty of the advisors, they must have regard to that code of practice when it comes to the code of practice that the attorneys must follow. Clearly, things like the size of the estate can have a bearing on this sort of thing. So if they're doing all sorts of different types of investments, that is going to have a bearing. But if you've got an estate that's worth, I don't know, 300,000 or 400,000, which is a reasonable size, but you want to go into and invest mum or dad's money in all sorts of high risk things, then that probably would be a bit of a no-no, because if there's a huge downturn, how do they make up that money, etc.? Or they could indeed lose all of that money. So just on the points on, so that's the issues with regard to powers of attorney, and obviously suitability of investments is crucially important. Some of the main factors of suitability is age and life expectancy, and the average age of a donor is apparently about 81, so it's quite elderly, isn't it? So those people, if you invest into something that has a downturn, it's very difficult for them to make that money up. So there's a responsibility there. So short-term investment codes are considered the best sort of investment, things like national savings and investments, etc. So the last point on lasting powers of attorney. So on the situation with abuse, I think there was quite a considerable amount of abuse under the old EPAs, the enduring powers of attorney, and hence the new I don't think you'll ever make it completely watertight with regard to abuse, but what they've tried to do is make it as watertight as possible. So with regard to an LPA, first of all, you have to have a certificate provider. So that's going to be someone that can attest that you've not been put under any pressure, that you know what you're doing, you understand what you're doing in giving somebody a power of attorney. So it's got to be, therefore, it's got to be someone that's known you for at least 2 years, or a professional person such as a doctor, solicitor. It could be a financial advisor. They just have to put on the document, you know, what their professional qualifications are that give them the right to be a certificate provider. And then all powers of attorney now, LPAs must be registered with the Court of Protection through the Office of the Public Guardian before they can be used, and they now keep a register of all lasting powers of attorney. Just on an international scale, I don't know if you saw the case with Michael Schumacher, German case, where he basically a Formula 1 racing driver, I don't think he had any major accidents when he was driving, went skiing, really bad accident, lost capacity, no power of attorney in place, and it was a nightmare. And I think he's still alive, and it's been a nightmare for his family to have to deal with that sort of thing. So really important that people get their powers of attorney in place, probably just as important as a will. So I'll now hand back to Martin, who's going to summarize our little session today.
Great, thanks, Graham.
60 seconds, Martin, if we can.
Okay, as you can see, there's a lot to pack into the session today, so I'm just going to leave you with a couple of bits. You know, in terms of, you know, validating disclosures, you know, just some practical things in terms of just taking, I think the message is taking this area seriously, isn't it? Understanding, validating disclosures, recognizing this as an issue, protecting confidentiality. Graham mentioned about, different times of day for contacting people. Is there a better time to call somebody, or to make sure that you're not going to put somebody in any kind of danger by not treating aspects confidentially and so forth. The big thing, I think, as well, is to signpost to the right organizations, being proactive. And again, we could talk forever about helping people regain control of finances, particularly after a relationship may have broken down and things like that. And the forbearance is talking around understanding a situation somebody might have gone through when it comes to credit and things like that, or why things may not be in a perfect order when somebody comes along as a client. It may be that there's some financial abuse that's taken place, which has caused bad credit ratings and things of that nature. Really useful document. We'll put this on our stand as well, the SEA document, in terms of where that signposting might go to. So a big list of organizations that can help you with all of this as well. So I'm gonna pretty much leave it there, aside from going through. So I've got lots of information at our stand, and we've got, so if you want us to talk some more, we've got some videos there as well, some other sessions regarding the retirement income side of things. But yeah, I'm doing a whistle-stop tour of that, because I know we're sort of need to stay as close to time as we can, Chris. So there we go. There's the important slide that obviously you need to read and expand your screen. So look at that one.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you, Graham. Obviously, a really important topic. In 45 minutes was always going to be optimistic, I think, getting through the through that. But we have had a few questions coming in. So I think probably the best way to pick those up will either be sort of via the Just table, which is next to the Just logo on the Remo platform, back in the main auditorium. And again, we will be having a speaker Q&A session at 4 p.m. this afternoon. So again, if you'd like to pick up those particular questions with Graham and Martin as well. So thank you once again. This is where we'd normally give you a round of applause, but perhaps the virtual one would be the best we can do in this case. Just in terms of directions, we now have a networking break back in the main auditorium. So you'll need to leave the Salon Lounge, go back to the conference portal, which is financialplanning20.com, and then click into the, as I say, the Norton Auditorium, where we'll have a short networking break and then ready for the next session. So thanks once again, Martin. Thank you, Graham, and we'll speak to you later. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you.